Welcome back to it. Try again. Welcome back, AP. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our continuing discussion of unit number 6. All right, so we're now currently in unit 6 out of 9 of the entirety of the AP curriculum, right? Of the AP European History curriculum. In a few more short units, you will all be masters of AP European content, and you'll all go off and get 5s on your AP Euro exam. Now, to actually get a really good score on AP Euro, you have to unfortunately learn this unit, which is a jigsaw puzzle of random shenanigans that are going on during the 1800s, right? So basically when you're looking at unit 6, it's like things that are going off in the things that are going on in the 1800s, like leading up to 1850 something ish, right? So we just finished up talking about a really big deal that was going on in the 1800s, which was the revolutions of 1848, right? We just wrapped up our discussion in class about Austria and Prussia and how those two are going to be very different from the French Revolution of 1848, and how they're also going to be congruently different from also the 17 other revolutions that actually went down. So we talked about how actually in class, the French Revolution of 1848 was much more related to class consciousness and social classes, whereas the Austrian Revolution was much more related to growing sentiments of nationalism and self-determination, and how the Prussian Revolution of 1848 is going to be much more related to the ideas of nationalism and creating a unified German state. And where we left off in class is Frederick William IV, the Kaiser of Prussia at the time, didn't want to become a constitutional monarch, kind of exactly like what Penelope said at the end of class. He didn't want to be a constitutional monarch like Charles and the kings of England. He wanted to stay an absolutist, right? He tried to adopt these things at first, but then used a small war to kind of renegotiate that entire idea, liquidate that bad boy called the Frankfurt Parliament, because he refused to take the crown from the gutter, right? Which is, I think this is one of the most funny little, cartoons that has ever existed in European history. Look at Frederick William IV being like, look at this gutter crown, I don't want it. So, now, but the big thing about it, though, is he would consider that crown from the gutter a paper Burger King-style crown because it's the crown of a constitutional monarch, not one of an absolute leader, right? And we talked about in class as well that the revolutions of 1848 are considered to be failed revolutions, right? Because the reforms that were ultimately rolled in actually do then get rolled back from conservative and middle-class regimes going forward. Now, going into it, though, that we do need to understand is there are a couple of lingering, lasting effects of the entirety of the revolutions of 1848. You need to write both of these things down. The two biggest effects of the revolutions of 1848 is it will get the ball rolling on nationalism and self-determination, because literally, look right here, you've got the growing idea of a unified German state. That will spread also to Italy, and Italy will create itself into a brand new country by 1861. Germany becomes a country by 1871. Those are 2 years that are really easy to remember because it's 1861, 1871. So the big thing that we need to understand, though, as well, is also that that's going to get that ball rolling. But another thing is that the revolutions of 1848 basically were the final death stroke of feudalism throughout Europe, right? It kind of signaled the end that, serfdom is dead and over, right? That the ideas of the feudal state and feudal, militaries and feudal wealth and feudal monarchies are just all gone, forgotten, done, and dead, right? And that the ideas of capitalism and the growing industrial era is kind of just demonstrating its inefficiencies and how basically it's done and it's over, right? So the revolutions of 1848 seem like they're unsuccessful, but I think ending feudalism is a pretty big deal, right? So going into it, though, you need to understand one other really big thing that happened after the revolutions of 1848. And after the revolutions of 1848, something major that went down is that we actually noticed, historians went back and noticed that the revolutions of 1848 touched everywhere except for 2 countries, right? One being Great Britain, and Great Britain was completely untouched by the revolutions of 1848 because their reform movements had began about 10 years earlier, 15 years earlier than 1848, and they were already trying to reform a lot of the things that the industrial era began to show weaknesses in. Let's get rid of child labor. Let's try to regulate work standards, right? Let's try to actually, get rid of those old corn laws after the Peterloo Massacre, right? So the thing about it, though, in general, is that, British, they didn't get hit by the revolutions of 1848 because of that. Also, though, Russia didn't get hit by the revolutions of 1848. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that the feudal system was still very much reinforced there. And also because of Russia's very, very vast territory, it would be almost impossible for people to have a massive revolution like that or to actually clog the streets. And also, when you cling to that feudal idea, there's not even enough people in the cities to have a revolution in general. But what is going to happen to Russia, though, is they are going to get a very big black eye in the 1850s that's going to demonstrate to them that they are behind the times, right? And so, like, in the 1850s, Russia is going to go through another modernization spree, a lot like what Peter the Great did during the 1600s, right? So going into what we need to understand, though, is that the state of affairs in Russia around 1850 is that 90% of the population still lives off the land, right? And they live off the land in the form of either still being a feudal serf or they are a peasant somewhere in a village outside of the larger cities of Moscow and St. Petersburg, right? Most people, about 90% of people in Russia, are poor and agrarian, right? Now, agrarian meaning, again, that they live off the land and they still use outdated farming techniques that are equivalent to that of, like, the farming techniques used before the agricultural revolution, right? Feudalism is still highly in effect, and it also is very politically tumultuous, right? What we need to remember, though, as well, is that the Decembrist revolt that went down in 1825 saw Nicholas I, the Romanov Tsar, shoot a bunch of his own military officers because they favored his brother, who had, behind closed doors, decided to step out of the line of secession, right? It is politically tumultuous in the sense that they have a really extreme absolute government that if you buck back against them, they'll simply just kill you or exile you to Siberia, right? Now, something really, really big, though, is going to go down in the 1850s. Now, in 1853 from 1856, Russia is going to get swept up into a war, right? And you don't need to know much about this war other than its cause and also its biggest effect, right? Now, the Crimean War is what it's going to be called. Now, Crimea is a very, very large, or it's a small region of Russia that borders the Black Sea, right? The Black Sea has always been a very large trade thoroughfare for anybody that can control that waterway. For those of you who don't know where the Black Sea is, I would highly suggest looking it up on a map real quick, right? But where it is in the modern era is it actually borders the northern territory of what is now modern-day Turkey, and there is a strait of water that connects it to the Mediterranean Sea. Now, does Russia already have a warm water port? Yes, they do. They have St. Petersburg that was established under Peter the Great during the 1600s and 1700s, right? I think it's the 1700s, actually. It is the 1700s. I'm an idiot. I said 1600s earlier. It's the 1700s when Peter the Great actually established St. Petersburg. But the thing that we need to understand, though, is going into it, yes, they do have that. But, y'all, is there any harm in having more warm water ports? No, and the Russians see this as an opportunity to go out there and gobble up some new territory, because something that you need to understand is that the Ottoman is crumbling, right? The Ottoman territories are crumbling, and they have always, for a very long time, really controlled that Black Sea territory and this area right here, known as the Strait of Dardanelles, right? The Dardanelles Strait that connects the Mediterranean to the Black Sea makes it a very legitimate thoroughfare and connects you to the trade networks of not only Europe, but also of Western Asia, right? Now, the thing about it, though, is that the Ottoman is getting very much smaller, and it's starting to get a lot weaker because their inability to modernize is also showing. Now, the cause of the war is that Russians claimed that the Ottomans were, like, destroying Christian sites and things like that towards the area of what is known as Crimea. By the way, Crimea is right there when you're looking at a map, or, like, actually right there if you want a little bit of a closer sight, and these are some of where the major battles went down, the principal sites of the Crimean War. Now, the Russians, though, in this war were blown out, right? They were blown out in a really dramatic way and in an embarrassing way, earning that black eye that I was talking about, that they're now going to have to wear around the party that is European politics and have to explain how the Ottomans mollywopped them in the mouth, right? Well, the thing about it is that you got to remember is it wasn't just the Ottomans, right? The Russians were blown out by the Ottomans and everybody else, like literally everyone else in Europe, allied with the Ottomans and fought against the Russians. I'm talking France. I'm talking Great Britain. I'm talking areas in northern Italy even allied with the British and the French and the Ottomans to push the Russians back. Now, why would they do this, right? Because as we remember, everyone helped the Greeks beat back the Ottomans, right? But you got to remember common fears, common enemies, and the balance of power, right? You gotta always remember that France and Great Britain live in fear of the balance of power being tipped, right? And if the Ottomans are shrinking and getting smaller, that is gonna leave a lot of land left over for the Russians to gobble up, right? And if the Russians got too big and too imposing, then they feared for their own safety later on. So the English and the French are gonna ally with the Ottomans to try and keep the Russians at bay, right? And so they actually ally with them, and they get smacked in the mouth. Like the Russians get royally slapped around. And the big reason why they get blown out, though, is because, one, serfs weren't allowed in the army, which is 90% of your population, right? So 90% of your population wasn't even allowed to be in the army whatsoever because of your really, really outdated social class constructs, right? And then also going into it as well, Russia was just technologically behind everyone again, right? Like, so like after like Peter the Great, 200 or about like 150 years before this, establishes the St. Petersburg area, and then also creates a warm water port and starts trying to create a modern Russian standing army. The Romanovs that followed Peter the Great didn't modernize quite like he did. They got stalled out and really hit into an area of plateauing, right? So the thing is though, is a good example that you can see this from is this concept right here, rifled versus unrifled muskets, okay? Most of the European powers by the 1850s were entering into this war using a technology known as rifling your musket, right? And the way that actually works is if we're looking at a gun barrel on an actual musket, actually let's look at it together really quick, okay? We'll like pull up a picture real fast. So like now, if we're looking at a rifled musket barrel, okay? So when we're talking about a barrel, there we go. So when we're talking about a musket, all right, many of the other European powers had learned that if you rifle the barrel of a musket, which means to cut a series of spiralized grooves down the barrel, it actually helps direct the bullet in a more dramatic way and causes it to spin much like this football, right? And it'll come out of that barrel spinning in a direction to keep it from catching spin and hooking one weird way or another. Well, everybody that fought against the Russians was using musket rifling, much like in the images right here, whereas the Russians were still using unrifled muskets that are really ineffective and cause the actual bullet that comes out to spin in weird directions, making them vastly inaccurate. So that is a really good example that just demonstrates to us that Russia was technologically behind. Also, Russia had a very outdated infrastructure and transportation system. When Russia was bringing goods to the front lines of the Crimean War, they were doing so using carts and mules, whereas everybody else was like shipping this stuff there using railroads and industrial infrastructure that's coming in after the Industrial Revolution. So what is the fix after Russia gets slapped in the teeth during this Crimean War? Well, the fix, y'all, is to modernize, right? And just like under Peter the Great, you're going to see a new Russian czar rise up who's going to realize that this war signals the need for modernization. And this man's name is Alexander II, right? Alexander II is a very, very important Russian leader because he is the Romanov czar that watched and witnessed the downfall of the Crimean War, and he pledged to modernize Russia in a very strong and dramatic way, right? He wants to do a lot of very, very great things, and he literally is the leader or the reform mover that actually is going to push Russia in the direction of becoming, again, a more legitimate and modern power throughout most of Europe. He is going to be called, his series of reforms is going to be called the Great Russian Reforms, and one of the biggest things he decides to do is to free up labor so that you can create an industrial economy. So he wants to free the serfs and end feudalism, right? Now, the interesting thing about this, though, is that it takes him a little while to get this program rolling, right? The thing that ends up happening is by 1861, he finally abolishes feudalism throughout all of Russia, right? He abolishes serfdom in 1861, and he does this in a very dramatic proclamation right out front of the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. He says, from here on out, there will be no feudal serfs, no feudalism, and no serfdom in Russia anymore. And he actually says that the serfs are allowed to actually even buy some of the land from the lords and nobles. Now, it's a really, really wonky system. It doesn't work out very perfectly. But he also begins to create local representative governments, right? He wants to create local representative governments so even small villages have a voice in their government. There are these things called zemstvos, right? Zemstvos are these like local parliaments so they can report back to the national government on their needs and their modernization needs to actually create better movements and better situations for the people of Russia, right? He also creates equality before the law so that everybody who is, whether they be noble or whether they be poor, peasant, they all will be actually subject to the same laws as everyone else should be. He also pushes the idea of industrializing Russia. He wants factories. He wants railroads. He wants the things that everybody else in Europe has got. He wants to get back up on par with them as well. But he realizes that with Russia being so poor and agrarian, and most Russian villages looking like this, where they're harvesting grain still using scythes and sickles, he realizes that the way to do this is going to be foreign capital, because there's not enough people in Russia with enough money to invest in these large-scale factories, so instead he wants to encourage maybe some British money or some French money or maybe this Prussian money to come over and create a factory within Russia, right? And to actually use foreign capital to see if they'll actually boost that economy up quite a bit, right? But then the unfortunate thing that ends up happening is he is assassinated before all of his stuff fully forms, right? Now, he does still get rid of serfdom, which is a major thing, and he does create equality before the law, but because of his assassination, the Zemstvos never really fully form and stuff like that. The industrialization of Russia starts moving in a great direction, but it doesn't actually really get to full-fledged factory systems and steam engines and steam power, much like he had actually hoped. Now, he was assassinated because basically, y'all, you can jot this down if you want, he gets assassinated mostly due to the fact that it was like everybody cool at the time during the 1800s was trying to assassinate their local leaders, right? So, like, if we look back to Louis Philippe during, like, the, leading up to the Revolution of 1848 in France, remember they tied all those 25 gun barrels together and tried to shoot them 400 different times at once? That was very endemic of what was going on during the era, right? Like, assassinating leaders and leaders of state became so popular that Napoleon III, the president of France at the time, had to ride around in a bulletproof carriage, right? Because he'd been shot at that many times. Now, I'll tell you the assassination story if you want to hear it in class, but just ask me and be like, hey, Mr. Terry, what happened on the crazy day that Tsar Alexander II got assassinated? But it's a really, really cool story. I absolutely love it. Like, a lot of people don't love it as much as I do, but I still think it's crazy because nobody would want to go in this way. But they actually built a very, very large church on the location of where he was assassinated in St. Petersburg. It's a place called the Church of the Spilt Blood, and it reminds me a lot of St. Basil's Cathedral. But on this location is where Alexander II was actually assassinated. Now, going into it, though, rule is going to pass, though, to his more conservative son, all right? Now, to give you a connection to Alexander II so you can start to feel some type of way about him, his son is Alexander III. His grandson is Nicholas II, the father of Anastasia and the last Tsar of Russia, right? So, like, to give you, like, a little bit of a connection in the long run, Rasputin is about, like, a spit right down the road, and we'll be talking about him pretty soon because all that stuff comes around in 1917, right? Now, the thing about it, though, is his brother, or is his son, Alexander III, right, is going to actually not finish many of these reforms. But one person that actually is connected to Alexander III is going to try and push them along a little bit. By the way, that's Alexander III, his son, by the way, who just looks like no fun at a party, right? But there is this guy that comes along named Sergei Witte, right, who is the finance minister to Alexander III, who wants to take the leftover bits and pieces of the Alexander II reforms and try to push it forward a little bit, right? And so Sergei Witte comes along and he decides to try and create more effective things to try and accomplish some of Alexander II's ideas. First and foremost, he wants to create protective tariffs to make it sure that Russians are buying Russian products rather than buying foreignly created products, because he wants to try and make sure that we're boosting industry within Russia, even if we're trying to encourage foreign factories to use the freed up labor as well. Puts Russia on the gold standard as well, which is a form of an economy where every dollar you print or ruble you print must be backed up by a dollar's worth of gold within a Federal Reserve someplace, right? It keeps your economy stable, and it also helps prevent that all-inspiring death toll of a thing known as inflation, right? The other thing about it, though, as well, is Sergei Witte proposes one of the most bold and daring ideas that anybody in Europe had ever seen. He wants to railroad Russia. But the thing about it is, y'all, when you're trying to lay railroads in, like, Great Britain, it's not that difficult because, like, Great Britain's not that big, right? Russia, y'all, is huge. And Sergei Witte comes up with an idea, and he proposes to the Russian government and to Alexander III. He's like, we should build a railway that spans the entirety of this country, right? And it was known as the Trans-Siberian Railway. And this railway will make Russia quite a bit of money, but it also is going to get them into a war with Japan a little bit later on. Keep that in the back of your mind, all right? Now, all these things, though, are going to make Russians elite pretty prosperous, because when you combine Alexander II reforms and Sergei Witte's pushing through of these reforms in his second modernization wave of Russia, what's going to happen is Russian elites become very, very wealthy. But remember, you're not going to get these people to rise up through the ranks using modernization processes, right? So much of Russia was still left very, very poor, and now you've got a growing factory class that is actually growing in Russia, where you're taking these people from the rural areas, and they're now working in factories, so they're just as disenchanted with the structures of Russia, and they're still just as poor, right? And so the thing about it is, Russian wealthy people got even more wealthy, and the economy made a lot of money, but most people were still insanely poor. And so by 1905, they're going to have their first revolution, right? They have a failed revolution in 1905, which is kind of like their revolution of 1848, just 50 years later, right? And it doesn't go very well. A bunch of people get shot on a day called Bloody Sunday. It's like a whole thing, right? Now, going into the next thing that we're going to discuss, though, so that's the modernization of Russia, right? And just know that Russia is on the map. They're trying to move things in the right direction, and that Crimean War left them very, very embarrassed, right? Now, going into the next thing we need to understand is the ideologies of change and reform, right? So the 1848 revolution is going to expose a lot of flaws within the constructs of European society, right? And so we've already talked a lot about some of these people, but the College Board wants us to define them at this point of the content, right? And what I like to refer to them as is all the isms, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to go back to that spectrum graph that we talked about with the age of Metternich, with the conservatives and the classical liberals and the socialists, and we're going to talk about how the revolutions of 1848 are going to kind of begin to change their ideologies a little bit, and then also, for some of them, reinforce them, right? So the thing about it is like all these isms that you're now about to hear about, whether it be conservatism, classical liberalism, socialism, Chartism, imperialism, nationalism, self-determination is not an ism, but still pretty close. All industrialism, all these isms were inspired by the Industrial Revolution, the rupture of the status quo being the French Revolution, the suppression of ideas in nationalism during the age of Metternich, and the suppression of revolts and early reform movements like the Peterloo, the Corn Laws, and the revolutions of 1848. So when we talk about all these isms, you also, there are even isms within isms. So I need you to prepare yourself, okay? When I use the word isms, I'm basically just referring to historical terminologies that ends in the word ISM, right? And the ones you already know are conservatism, classical liberalism, and socialism. Now, we're not going to go hardcore on conservatism because they don't really exist anymore, and they're a dying star, right? Because literally nobody wants absolutism for very much longer. But the classical liberals, though, need a little bit of extra buffing out. You need to understand that these are going to be the guys that are beginning to get elected to parliaments and getting elected to local governments. And it all, of course, begins back in England, of course, right? Now, who are these people? To give a very, very specific definition to who the classical liberals are, they are the post-industrial middle class, and they are the enlightened upper class, right? So the people from the upper class that were enlightened, much like the Marquis de Lafayette was going into the French Revolution, are going to be the ones that drive home the idea of classical liberalism because they see problems in society and they believe that they need to be changed. So examples of these individuals that we've talked about so far that you would argue are classical liberals are people like the Marquis de Lafayette, Thomas Jefferson in the 1700s. Winston Churchill could be considered a classical liberal as well. For those of you who know him, he is actually the Prime Minister of England during World War II, and he also was War Council and Security Council member in the Parliament during World War I. Now, when he was young, you would consider him a liberal, but later in life, you would consider him a conservative. So as we can see, this spectrum is very amorphous, and it changes a lot. Then you also have two other figures that we're going to talk about a little bit more in the back half of this unit, where we're talking about John Stuart Mill and this guy named Jeremy Bentham, right? Now, do not ask me why this man's face looks this way. I don't know. I'm in the process of looking it up. John Stuart Mill, what happened with all of this? But that right there is Jeremy Bentham, and we'll actually talk about him again a little bit later on. But John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham kind of represent the ideas of classical liberalism because they believe that by bettering most people and bettering everybody else's situation, you'll be able to basically encourage them to be individuals, and they'll go out there and work for themselves. And if they work for themselves, everyone in society moves forward, right? Things that classical liberals like are limited governments, which is like that laissez-faire ideology. They like free market capitalism that was outlined by Adam Smith. They liked enlightened self-interest as well, which is the idea that if everybody is out there trying to do the best for themselves, then the ball will continue to roll forward and we will all progress as a society. They also love this concept, popular sovereignty, right? Popular sovereignty is the concept where the hands or the power of the government lies in the hands of the people, right? Where they elect officials to representative bodies that then go off and try to do the best by their constituents, right? They also believe that they think they should extend suffrage, but notice I have extended suffrage, not universal suffrage. But another thing that liberals love is imperialism and nationalism. We'll talk about those in the next unit quite a bit, right? We're not going to worry about those too much right now, but we're going to worry about them a little bit later. Now, what are some things that classical liberals dislike? Well, they don't like universal suffrage because they think poor people don't know how to vote and that they'll only vote with their stomachs, or they'll vote for names they recognize, which they're not wrong, right? So now, they also do not like economic controls. They don't like the idea that the conservatives want to tell you what country you can and can't buy from, and they don't like the idea that the socialists want to set prices on bread when the market should help the thing fluctuate to a degree, right? Now, they also do not like protective tariffs because they believe that you should be able to sell goods to whoever you want. Free of those markets. Let those markets operate in any way they so choose. And they also believe that high and unnecessary taxes are the bane of the devil, right? So that actually comes from Adam Smith. Adam Smith said that a government should only actually tax people enough to provide for its defense and for its public works, right? Now, this group out of all of them, out of the conservatives, out of the socialists, they're the most Plato-like out of all of them. Now, when I say that, I mean that they can kind of be like mushed and formed in different ways, right? Because what's going to happen over time is some different movements like Chartism and people who are beginning to advocate for like female suffrage are going to really kind of show them that there are flaws in their ideas, right? And it's going to cause some of them to kind of change over time. Some of them will drift closer to socialism. Some of them will drift closer to like conservatism. But out of all of them, the ones that can be like molded in the most ways, right? And then as time goes on, when conservatism as they know it in the 1800s dies off, the top end of classical liberals become the new conservatives, right? And then the classical liberals in the middle become a little more socialist, okay? So Chartism, just to give you a little bit of a definition of what I'm talking about here, Chartism was a really, really big event that actually went down in Great Britain where a lot of like not armed, but a lot of large-scale protests were held because they wanted to expand suffrage to all people, right? Regardless of wealth, regardless of class, and they wanted universal suffrage for all working men. And then there are people like Flora Tristan who actually also said, not only do working men deserve the right to vote, but women do as well, because we are the ones who every single time a war breaks out, we are the ones who save your lives. We are the ones who enter those factories. We are the ones who keep the economy rolling. So why do women not deserve the right to vote as well, right? So going into it, though, their reactions to these things will demonstrate that they actually have flaws in their ideas. And they're going to push many classical liberals to adopt more socialist perspective as time goes on, or drift towards the conservative side as well. For example, John Stuart Mill is one of the best reactionaries to Flora Tristan. He actually wrote that the subjugation of women will forever destroy society. And he actually began to advocate for women's suffrage and for the increasing of women's rights. And he himself is a classical liberal, and that would be considered a little bit more of a socialist idea as time goes on. So John Stuart Mill is a really great example of a liberal that is in that kind of Plato, amorphous kind of style. You know what I'm talking about? The biggest thing that they're sticklers about, though, is the economy. They just don't want you to touch their money, and they want to be able to make money on their own in this dog-eat-dog free market society. But that right there is where we're going to wrap it up because I just brain dumped on you a lot, okay? But we're going to go ahead and keep it right there. I'll see y'all tomorrow in class. We'll review a little bit, and we'll talk about the socialists and how these communists are going to start popping up as well in the 1840s.